connection is very good, so I think, yes, we can start.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to participate in this event. I would like to thank Snezhana Nosova, Anton Terentiev, and Irina Guzheva for their assistance and patience. My purpose in this conference is to share my area of interest with you and how it relates to visual communications in new media. My research and teaching focuses on maps as a means of visual communication. Maps have always been a powerful means of communication. They have communicated knowledge, power, and direction since the earliest humans used a stick to sketch locations in the dirt. They represent human knowledge of the known world at any given time. Historically, that known world was, by current standards, limited, but to those living in that limited world, it was vast. Their sketch maps represented what they knew of their environment. Maps also represented power, either implicitly or explicitly. Implicitly, they represented power because those drawing the map had either the skill or the knowledge, or indeed both, to do so. This in and of itself is power. That ability, whether in the form of skill or knowledge, is not ubiquitous. Maps could also be used to define power explicitly, communicating territorial rights, claims, and acquisitions. Maps constructed for the purpose of communicating direction, such as the location of particular ocean currents or hunting grounds, while seemingly utilitarian, could also implicitly communicate knowledge and power. Consider the person who discovered the location of a particular hunting ground. He exudes power because he has valuable knowledge that he can either choose to share or not through communicating the location using a sketch map. He is perhaps admired and envied for his adventurous and intrepid nature at locating the hunting ground. While maps still provide us with location information and assist us in navigating the unknown, maps have also taken on a less literal and more figurative role. Maps have been used to visualize the source of disease, perpetuate nationalistic stereotypes, illustrate power struggles, convey religious dogma, highlight the source of pollution, and visualize patterns unseen by the human eye. Virtually anything can be mapped, and virtually anyone can create the map. My goal is to demonstrate that in spite of changes in the media available for communicating spatial information, the purpose and visual components of maps have changed very little since the Mappa Mundi, the iconic map of the Middle Ages, and what I have termed the Lorem Mappa, or the electronic map in its various forms that we find on almost any device that can tap into cyberspace. I will provide a retrospective of the evolution of maps through the traditional map communication model as a means of explaining the connections between the map maker and the map reader, and several more recent models that seek to explain that connection in the context of electronic media such as the Internet. I will begin my retrospective of maps as a means of visual communication beginning in the Middle Ages because the maps of this period are so extreme in their centeredness, and I would argue not so very different in terms of purpose as they are today. While some maps from the Middle Ages were functional, such as the Portolan charts used by mariners, maps of land were more figurative. These maps are known as T&O maps because the main waterways formed what appeared to be a T in the midst of a circular O-shaped landmass. These maps were essentially vehicles for Christian dogma. Jerusalem was typically located in the center, with Paradise, or the Orient, located at the top. Europe was located on the left, and the continent of Africa on the right. The Mediterranean Sea was the upright part of the T, while the Don River on the left and the Nile River on the right formed the crosspiece of the T. Surrounding the landmass was the river Oceanus. T&O maps varied in the details depending on where they were created. In the case of this Mappa Mundi, for example, the British Isles are visible in the northwest portion of Europe with local landmarks filling the land area. The remainder of the map was filled with drawings of biblical references, including Moses as well as creatures from mythology, such as Charybdis and Scylla. Known places tended to be represented by the divine, including images of Christ, God, and the saints, while unknown places were illustrated with demonic and fanciful creatures that reinforced the prevailing view that these places were considered off the beaten path and should therefore be avoided. For the most part, these maps were not used for navigation, but rather represented a summary of deeds and public iconography. Thus, these maps were first centered on the divine and then focused on the contributions of the local, or what were perceived as local. Geometric accuracy was not the goal. Indeed, there is evidence to show that the information included was simply limited by the size of the page. While geometric and geographic accuracy are now more often than not a key component of maps, the need to center them on local contributions has not changed. If anything, technology has made it easier to recenter the world with greater ease, the geographical and geometric accuracy following by default. I can now easily enter the coordinates of my location in Fredonia, New York, and create a geographically correct representation of the world centered on that location. Thus, the world revolves around me, so to speak, just as the world centered on Jerusalem in the Middle Ages. It is important to remember that unlike maps created for the sole purpose of navigation, Mappa Mundi were often created as the introduction to manuscripts. In much the same way a table of contents serves to outline the contents of a book, so too did a Mappa Mundi provide an overview of what was to come in a particular manuscript. To a certain extent, we still create maps for this purpose. We want to assist the reader in visualizing the written word. The maps you see here are all maps from manuscripts. They are not necessarily T and O maps, but they are representative of maps from the 11th through the 14th centuries. The one on the top and the one on the lower left are both maps from the Muslim world dating to the 11th and 12th centuries, respectively, while the one in the lower right was created in China in the 1300s. All serve to provide an overview to the text or manuscript that followed. During the Middle Ages, maps were primarily created by illustrators or scribes who did not directly experience the areas they mapped. Instead, the information on maps was brought by travelers, pilgrims, explorers, and soldiers in the form of verbal descriptions that were translated, so to speak, by the illustrator into a graphic form. The illustrator or scribe was more often than not an artist rather than a cartographer. The role of the illustrator was to document geographical information, if not for the purpose of planning pilgrimages, then certainly as symbols of secular and spiritual influence. In terms of the map communication model that became prevalent in the 1960s, the medieval illustrator is given the information verbally by the traveler, probably in the form of an itinerary. It was up to the illustrator to put this itinerary in graphic form, thus creating a map. The map was most commonly included as a supplement to a manuscript. The message communicated to the manuscript reader was figurative in nature. Those reading the manuscript were not likely to engage in travel themselves, but used the map as a means to visualize the secular and spiritual world. Evaluation and feedback, as shown in this particular model, were not a specific goal in that process. For one thing, the production of a map was highly labor-intensive. It was unlikely the illustrator would be available or even willing to make changes to the map. For another, that was not the purpose of the map. These maps were an end in and of themselves. The information was communicated, and it was up to the map reader to interpret and make sense of it. Clearly, the communication model that was first introduced in the 1960s was not devised to explain the maps of the Middle Ages. It was rather formulated to improve the effectiveness of modern maps. At this point, published maps are typically made by trained cartographers, whose goal it was to communicate information in map form, such that the map's intended purpose was easily accessed by the map reader. Feedback and multiple representations of the data were encouraged. Geographers and others interested in communicating spatial data in patterns sought to achieve this in the most intuitive way possible. Map reading was to be facilitated rather than dictated. The reality was that there really was no feedback or evaluation on a map-by-map basis. There has been extensive research into improving the ability of maps to communicate effectively through the use of visual variables, but in terms of individual maps, the feedback usually went toward improving subsequent maps rather than the map itself. It was simply not easy to create a map, even in modern times. Publish it for feedback, and then revise it based on that feedback. Until the 1980s and even into the 1990s, map creation was still labor-intensive, involving the use of pen and ink, scribe coat, and the darkroom. The map communication model is therefore relevant to earlier maps such as the Mappa Mundi. Certainly in both cases, there was a clear separation between the person making the map and the person reading the map. By the 1990s, as computers began to be used more and more to make maps, the notion that anyone could make a map evolved into a critical view of maps as a means of communication. The power was no longer in the hands of a few. Indeed, a postmodern view of the map was occurring, suggesting that maps should be deconstructed to expose the map as an artifact of power and selective knowledge. Merely viewing maps as a means of communication obscured the potential underlying bias of the map and the map maker. In other words, could maps now be analyzed as politicized documents? This point of view does not necessarily remove the communication component of the map, but it is a more nuanced and critical view of maps. Maps should no longer be viewed as objective end products. So, in a sense, we should view contemporary maps as subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, vehicles of propaganda. Just as the Hereford Mappa Mundi had an overt agenda, so too does a contemporary map have at least an underlying agenda. That agenda is necessarily rooted in cultural, historical, and political interests. In addition to the deconstruction of mapping in search of the embedded power relations, criticism of the map communication model also came from the perspective that the separation between the map maker and map reader is not so distinct. The separation is more of a continuum that varies depending on how the map is used. McEachran and Taylor's cartography cubed model adds visualization to the mix to aid in understanding the different ways maps are used. Visualization in this context refers to the ability of maps, graphics, and images to make visible spatial relationships. Arguably, those making maps have been engaged in visualization ever since the first map was sketched in the dirt with a stick. For the purposes of this model, there are, however, important differences. For contemporary maps in a new media environment, visualization refers to the added capabilities of interactive mapping software, for example, through data exploration. The visualization environment emphasizes the process of exploration over the product to be presented. Thus, McEachran's and Taylor's cube contains 3 dimensions, ranging from private to public, highly interactive to minimally interactive, and a presentation of knowns to the revelation of unknowns. Where traditional map-making has emphasized public use, little or no interactivity, and presenting only known information, visualization in the context of mapping emphasizes private use of maps, high interactivity, and the exploration of unknown information. This model acknowledges the use of maps as a tool in data exploration. Maps are not necessarily created for public use, but rather are created to assist in private research, along with many other data exploration tools. At this point, I would like to introduce the concept of the Lorem Mappa, which I have chosen to loosely mean internet or electronic map in the parlance of the Middle Ages, were such things in existence then. The Lorem Mappa would include any electronic maps, whether viewable on the internet or not. The challenge is that the variety of maps has increased dramatically, making it difficult to apply a single model to all. There are desktop software packages that can be used to create maps privately and then shared publicly. There are online web map services that are highly interactive and allow the private creation of maps. Some map services act as navigation aids, while others facilitate the visualization of tabular data and narrative descriptions. Just as traditional print maps created for presentation do, they all endeavor to communicate information. But as the cartography cubed model offers, there are differences in the extent to which the map reader is also the map creator, the extent to which visualization is employed, the extent to which known and unknown information is revealed, and finally, the extent to which any of that information is even shared. Regardless, all of these map services are increasingly capable of providing their users with cartographically responsible options in terms of design, in the form of visual variables, data classification, symbology, and generalization, among others. From a postmodern perspective, the same underlying issues regarding cultural, historical, and political influences are evident. The choices available to users of these services are limited. Thus, users are forced to design their maps within the confines of limited choices in terms of color, projection, classification, scale, and style, among others. Even when operating within those confines, the resulting map takes on the values of the user, whether consciously or subconsciously. To accommodate the proliferation of interactive web-based mapping as a communication, a variation on the original communication model has been suggested. This model emphasizes what is termed near real-time feedback, whereby the map that is created is an amalgamation of the data provided by the database, the mapping utilities available in the web map server, the interface for the data and the utilities, and finally the decisions made by the user. This model allows for the user to change her mind at every step along the way. There is no need to wait for a new map to be designed, drafted, and published. The web map server and browser components facilitate the visualization. Thus, depending on the user's decisions, she can choose to present or explore data either privately or publicly, interacting with it based on the visualization tools. The challenges for making sense of maps, given the increasing array of new media available to us, are exciting to some in terms of the options available to us, yet daunting to others in the potential for the proliferation of self-centered or agenda-centered views of the world. Just as maps were vehicles for the religious dogma in the Middle Ages, so too are contemporary maps vehicles for furthering biased agendas in the guise of a supposedly trustworthy electronic map. Maps, just like the written word, are often accepted without question. Just because spatial information is displayed against the backdrop of what appears to be a geographically correct base map does not mean that information is accurate or free from bias. Esri's story maps, for example, are arguably modern versions of the Mappa Mundi. They are constructed around the specific interests of an individual or organization. The map maker is free to choose from a variety of base map choices and then upload geotagged images and data for display. The resulting maps may be shared widely or kept private. The images, for example, may include pictures of people without their consent, thus potentially invading their privacy. In addition to the potential for conveying dubious information, there is also the potential for harm by communicating an individual's location at any given time. Is there then a model that best represents the myriad formats in which map information can be communicated? Or has map communication become so complex in the context of new media that there are limitations to the sense that can be made of maps? Is a new research framework emerging in which maps are considered along with machine learning, computational linguistics, data mining, and so on as components of knowledge discovery in cyberspace? It would seem to me that such a framework does not dismiss or minimize the role of communication of maps, but rather strengthens their explorative and research capability. Such an interpretation fits neatly into McEachran's and Taylor's cartography cube. If anything, it can be argued that maps are more important than ever in communicating place-based information, and that new media provide the dynamic ability to present real-world change in real time. It is easier now, more than ever before, to manipulate the world around us through new media. Our need and craving for information about the world around us has not changed, nor fundamentally have the role maps played. What has changed is the ubiquity of maps and the ease with which they can be created. Although there are still barriers to access, the relative ease with which maps can be created and accessed behooves us to be more critical in terms of communication effectiveness, mapmaker bias, potential audience, and level of interactivity. Regardless of whether maps are presented as sketches in the dirt or on cave walls, as elaborate illustrations on animal skins or papyrus, or as pen and ink on paper, or as digital displays, maps are still used to communicate. Just as a verbal message can be laden with fact or fiction and everything in between, so too can a map. The critical eye with which maps should be created and used is no different than that which should be used when considering information of any type. In closing, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and express my appreciation to the organizers for this opportunity. Should you have any questions or wish to discuss any of this, I would be delighted to chat with you over email if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Diken. It was wonderful. Thank you. And your presentation is a wonderful visual closure to our today's session, because your report today is the last one, and it was wonderful, and we appreciate your special efforts in making it for this particular event, because we saw Tomsk out there on the map, so thank you again very much. You know, we were not arguing, we were discussing during your performance a little bit that mapping is kind of wonderful way or tool or instrument for, let's say, developing national identity, or even manipulating the feeling of patriotism. If you rotate the map and see it upside down, so Australia is the top of the world. If you rotate it again 90 degrees, right, it's Russia and China, and so far and so forth. The way you look at it really changes something in your mind right away, immediately. The one question is, right now we remember that there is in Stanford there is a so-called Republic of Scientists. This project between specialists and experts in geography, in mapping, in communications, and they created some kind of map of medieval letter exchange process. And they have a site, some wonderful researches are going on there. Do you have something like that? Do you interact with other professionals, other experts in other fields? Do you have any interdisciplinary research?
Yes, actually quite a bit. I work a lot with the local historians, creating maps or I guess trying to visualize what old cities look like. For example, old Philadelphia. And I'm actually working on a project right now with a Dutch colleague who's mapping what the subcontinent of India and Indonesia looked like when the Dutch were had a heavy influence in that area. So I have worked particularly with historians and also with environmental scientists, trying to map natural resources and preserve those natural resources. So yes, it's there's virtually very few disciplines where maps and geography are not involved.
Thank you. And there is one more question. There's a question from the head of our department. She believes that it's really important to give children at school, when they are still young and can perceive different ways of looking at this world, to give these different ways of looking at the map, just for them to understand that it's not something set and settled, or do you think it's there is no meaning in it, and maybe it will be even confusing for people to look at the world different ways? It's better to see it, you know, as we used to do.
No, I agree. I think that the sooner we can expose children, the better. In fact, I'm part of a group that we are trying to incorporate the ability to make maps in very early grades in school. So even kindergarten and first and second and third grades, getting them out to create their own maps. So there's an appreciation for places beyond where they live.
Thank you very much. This is the final report, and again, we appreciate a lot your efforts put into your presentation. We appreciate that you found time. I know that you had this a lot of going on in your life, and we, with our deadlines, were kind of in the middle of it. But thank you very much that you find time for that. We hope we'll get a paper for our publication in our proceedings.
I'm finishing that up.
Thank you. And yes, we're going to send you a nice certificate, one more Thank you. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks very much. Bye. Goodbye.